Greetings all! Well, this is slightly overdue. I have had the summer schedule from hell, and it hasn't helped that I'm in the middle of my master's thesis, which, if you're curious, is on the expansion and equipping of the US Army in the late 30s, early 40s. It was fortunate that I had the Black Horse series on deck to fill the time. But now it's back to regular operation. First, I will observe that the t-shirts are on sale again for the next couple of weeks. No new designs, it's just an opportunity to catch up if you missed them in the last time. Now also, I have been speaking with a couple of companies, you may have seen this on the notes, about getting a plush version of the emotional support missile done. So it'll be about 10 inches tall to start with, but much bigger ones, like body pillow sized ones, apparently are an option. But the small ones will come first and then we'll see about the larger ones. So keep an eye out on the various social media pages or the community tab for updates on that. So since I last sat here and spoke like this on a Q&A, I've completed a divisional level exercise called Warfighter as the Chief of Operations for an armor division, basically running the shop on the night shift. It was a lot of fun. And I have to say, it really does put an interesting color on operations. So if you think you know how a division works, you probably don't, unless you've been there or are really invested in reading the doctrine. I certainly didn't until I got there. Anyway, what else? I took part in Finnish brutality. Also a hell of a lot of fun, but the pain has caught up with me. I think my body has kind of said, congratulations, you've hit the half century, your warranty has expired. And things are going to start breaking now. After the first one, I don't know if I have many brutalities left in me. Oh well. I tried starting a gaming channel. It has failed miserably due to lack of time. I can't keep up with this primary channel, let alone the gaming one, but I will get back to it when I can. Still, priorities. And the priority right now is getting to a Q&A, which of course is a little bit delayed. So anyway, as always, questions from the patrons, and starting with Caleb Engelhardt with a bit of a meta question. How do you find and source reference documents so seemingly quickly? Do you have a database you pull from, or do you ask somebody who has access to that information via call, chat, email, etc.? Also, how do you prioritize what order which content gets uploaded and released on? Well, seemingly is the operative word. Obviously, I don't talk much about the reference documents I couldn't find. However, it helps to have a good database. My library up behind me and down below and over there and in the other room is reasonable, but I have a lot of stuff on digits as well. So when I went to the archives in NARA 2, I basically just scanned every single report I could find. Now, I would spend 3 or 4 days at a time, start scanning in the morning, skip lunch, and get kicked out in the evening. Years later, there are probably still documents that I haven't read. Same, I did the regional archives in Chicago, go to Fort Moore, whatever. If the folder looks interesting, start photographing it and read it later, because reading it I can do on my own time, but photographing the document I can only do when I've paid the money to go somewhere and rent the car and do the hotel, and it gets pricey and it's not cost effective. Of course, this does mean that my hard drive is a little bit of a mess. So what's happening, so as I'm writing this thesis I mentioned, is proving a bear, not because I have to research the information. I already know it, and I've got a very, very good memory for that sort of thing. The problem is finding the exact original document somewhere in my hard drive or on the book behind or whatever, so that I can cite it. And then, figuring out what the hell the citation is of the original document, especially if I scanned it, because I didn't keep great records of box numbers and the likes when I was scanning. I was too busy feeding the scanner as fast as possible. Online sources are surprisingly good as well. There are a number of websites with pretty good information, and DTIC, the Defense Technical and Intelligence Center, has a pretty reasonable open source collection as well. I'm sure you've encountered yourself various hyperlinks to reports for PDFs that have a URL that's dtic.mil on them. Now, on occasion, I do have to reach out to somebody, but as much as possible, I can try not to trouble them. And I reserve it for cases where I really have no other choice and I think the question is interesting enough to do it. As for prioritizing content, to a very large extent, it's a case of what do I have on hard drive next and can be edited quickly enough to meet the next Saturday upload. There are some things which do have a set release date. The 11th CAV series, for example, was timed for release just before the next Army Marketplace cycle. Otherwise, these videos are just by batch, depending on where I've been. 187 Sane, and I still think you want to stay with the trains, but anyway. My favourite Starfleet ship class, beyond Miranda and Original Constitution. Well, obviously, I'll have to go for a warship. Defiant is too obvious. I've always been a fan of the poor, anonymous workhorse. It's probably why I run an Imperial Guard army. And I'm quite happy being a simple tanker and really don't care whose Special Forces team has the best operators. So for Starfleet purposes, that basically I guess means Prometheus, Akira, or Achilles. Prometheus is just silly, and so that's out. Since Achilles is less aircraft carrier like Akira than it is a good old-fashioned gunship, I'll go with Achilles. Felicity Longus. Now that the National Armor and Cavalry Collection has been generally consolidated and I've had the opportunity to look over it, is there anything which has shown up where you have to ask, my God, how is it they have one of these? Or alternatively, has there been anything which you have seen and just had to sit back and appreciate, be it because it was cool, absurd, or whatever? It's going to sound a bit like a jaded answer, but no to the first and a qualified yes to the second. So most large collections are going to have something unique. I mean, I was at the Pacific War Museum in Fredericksburg, Texas a couple of weeks ago, and I was surprised to see the surviving Japanese midget submarine from Pearl Harbor was there. I mean, you would have thought it would be one in the Pearl Harbor Museum, but after the initial surprise and thinking about it, it actually made sense. And that's pretty much the case for all the vehicles in any collection. It would make sense that some unique vehicle like the T-23 Medium would be in Fort Moore, or the Panther II, or the XM-808, or whatever. But the same vehicle would also make sense in the Ordnance Museum at Fort Gregg Adams, or maybe something at Munster, or whatever. So I go to a museum expecting to see something you can't see anywhere else, but I don't normally get too surprised when I do see it. And the reverse answer kind of happens for the appreciation question, because if you consider a tank to be a work of engineering art, everything is to be appreciated because they all demonstrate innovative enough solutions to specific problems which existed at the time. Be it, let's say, the fiber optic backup site in the BAE MPF prototype or the autoloader of the T-69 Medium. And the second question he had, the 155mm armed T-58 was to be armed with heat and HEP to engage targets, and around the same time the British were considering the 183mm HESH. How did the US view the anti-tank capabilities of the big HEP/heat rounds of the time? Or were they more for anti-bunker and structural work? When the contract was first issued for T-58 in 1951, the three types of ammunition envisioned for the 155mm gun T-80 were HE, AP, and HVAP. If the test program for the T-30's 155mm is anything to go by, the purpose of the AP round, and indeed the tank in general, was primarily to defeat bunkers and other concrete fortifications. I guess the thinking was that T-29 or T-34 could deal with the anti-tank work. However, the inclusion of HVAP indicates a desire for anti-tank work by T-58. It seems unlikely that many bunkers could withstand a 155mm AP round repeatedly and require a HVAP round to crack it. In revision in 1952, however, the system was changed to 155mm gun howitzer T-180, a two-piece round without powder zoning, whatever that is, and ammunition types of HE, smoke, HEP, AP, and heat. HVAP had been deleted, which implies that perhaps anti-armor work was now going to be the purview of heat or maybe HEP. Or maybe the switch to a gun howitzer instead of a gun implied a de-emphasis of anti-armor work at all. Maybe that would be left to T-57. Or maybe the entire tank was not really supposed to have a doctrinal purpose per se and was simply an engineering experiment, and they wanted to try as many things as possible to see what the results would be. However, this question has definitely led to one of my more surprising research discoveries. Now, I can tell you that a 155mm HEP round tested for accuracy and lethality around 1958 had a grouping of about 5 feet wide at 1,000 yards and would punch through about 7 inches of armor at 60 degrees. Now granted, this was from a 155mm howitzer M1. The effect on an M36 that they had lying around when they hit it at the base of the turret ring was dramatic. It was an accident. The round was aimed at a plate which the M36 was kind of being used as a backstop for. It missed a plate and it hit the M36. So they decided to try again on a somewhat tougher target that they had lying around, a King Tiger hull. The arrows in the picture are broken welds, and the sizes of the scabs broken off on the other side are obvious. However, being engineers and for science, they were not satisfied. And they also had a slightly tweaked 155 round to try with it had a slightly different thickness of shell wall. And to make sure it was a fair comparison, they tried it on a second King Tiger hull. Now, I have absolutely no idea how Aberdeen happened to have a couple of King Tiger hulls sitting around to be used as ranged targets in the late 1950s. But there you go. As for the effect, and I quote, "A direct hit was scored on the main front plate with a resulting 14 by 18.5 inch back spall 2 inches deep. The hit, which was high order, fractured all the welds on the main front plate as well as all the welds on both sides. The hull was moved backwards 5 feet from the pre-firing position. It was decided that any further firing on the hull would fail to provide useful information as the damage was too extensive." Now, as an aside, they later did a metallurgical analysis and decided that the quality of the King Tiger armor was too poor to provide any useful protection against HESH in the first place. But regardless, anything that will move a King Tiger hull sitting on the ground without wheels back 5 feet is going to have an effect on any IS tank or T-55 it makes contact with. There were apparently no armor penetration tests of the 155mm Heat. The program was cancelled after only a few inert rounds were made and fired. However, the calculations were for up to 16 inches of RHA at 0 degrees or 8 inches at 60. So in other words, the Army seemed to have no qualms with the concept of either HEP or Heath's lethal effectiveness against armor. The issues were more a matter of the practicality of using a 155mm round in the first place, with its low ammunition capacity and presumably low rate of fire. So if the 120mm can do the job, why bother? Alright, Ariane, staying with big guns. I found mention of the M12 gunmotor carriage used as a direct fire weapon against fortifications and bunkers. Were there actual doctrine or examples of artillery pieces being used for direct fire besides this, or was it a case-by-case basis? A quick check of FM 6-40 and 6-20 of the time indicates yes, it was doctrinal, sort of. FM 6-20 in 1944 seems to indicate the use of heavy artillery in a sort of a traditional barrage mode against strong points, but also suggests the use of higher velocity artillery weapons capable of flat trajectories be used against embrasures and loopholes. When you get to FM 6-40 of 1945, however, all subtlety is gone out the window. Quote, "An artillery piece may be used for the destruction of caves, pillboxes, or other fixed fortifications. Any weapon of caliber less than 155mm is uneconomical for this purpose. The weapon must be in place at such a range as to make possible the obtaining of successive hits on the same portion of the target. Generally, this range should not exceed 2,500 to 3,000 yards, except for the 240mm howitzer, which can be effectively employed up to 4,000 yards. Pinpoint accuracy is vital. Because of their maneuverability and the rapidity with which they may be emplaced and displaced, self-propelled weapons are much better suited to this type of mission than are towed weapons. HE shell is used for the destruction of most fortifications. However, if the material to be penetrated is hard rock or heavy reinforced concrete, deeper penetration can be obtained with the use of armor-piercing projectiles fired at the highest striking velocity attainable. Since armor-piercing shell has little or no explosive filler, it tends to make a deep crater of small diameter. In order to widen this crater and clear away rubble when an armor-piercing shell is used, the observer should order a round of HE shell with concrete-piercing fuse every 4th or 5th round. Try to visualize what they're saying here, and it's fairly insane. You get the biggest damn gun you can find, and you batter away repeatedly at your target fortification using 6-inch explosive rounds only to clear away the rubble. And there's not a damn thing the guys in the bunker can do about it except wait and see if the next batch of 4 or 5 rounds will be the first to get all the way through. Mike Quinton, how reliable are the electronics on a tank when they get hit? Good question, and I am not sure if any results have ever been publicly released. I expect there won't be much effect though, given that solid state electronics don't really rattle. And I can't imagine that they will be happy enough to build a tank which entirely shuts down, including the engine control computer, as soon as it receives the first 125mm round to the face. I'll also note the prevalence of late of backup sights that are non-penetrating. They're basically a camera mounted on a battery-operated circuit instead of the more traditional physical optic. So if that's the backup sight, then presumably it's intended to keep operating after some form of a knock. Now granted, the primary could also be knocked out by direct impact damage, such as by artillery or small arms, but anyway. Another question, is there a difference between performance range, not just cruising range, between Russian and NATO tanks? So as you say, okay, the Russians could put fuel drums on the backs of the tanks, but really, are you ever going to drive 500 miles in a tank without a need to stop for something? And it's a fair point. I mean, back in the day, when you were a Centurion driver and looking for a fueler after about an hour and a half's road march, bringing extra fuel along with you probably isn't a bad idea, hence the mono-trailer and eventually the LR fuel tank to reduce the problem. In the Soviet perspective, since they presumably were the ones doing the initial attacking, I can see the argument for having the tanks already carrying their fuel for operational level movements to the front without having to draw upon the resources of additional truck companies. But yeah, once you're actually on the battlefield, pretty much all tanks, especially by the mid-1950s, had more than enough fuel on board without the need for additional fuel to conduct the tactical tasks required of them. The one interesting partial exception might be the external fuel blivets mounted on the M1s, but that also may simply have been a case of optimism on how far that they would get without getting shot at, triumphing over reality. Once they realized that the tanks were getting close enough to get shot without needing the additional fuel, the blivets went away and, well, I haven't seen them since the early 2000s. Another question. With crows and other RWSs being installed on turret tops, what about the whole thing getting knocked off while driving under trees and bridges or whatnot? Well, what about it? You're already supposed to be paying attention to trees hitting your tank, calibre 50 or whatever, and as for bridges, you're supposed to read the signs saying how high the bridge is. Supposed to. It's just another thing to consider, like, you think that bridge will take the weight of this tank? Only one way to find out. Alexander H. What are my thoughts on the Namer IFV? So when Namer, the APC, was in testing in the US, interestingly, it was primarily to evaluate the various technical features it had installed. It wasn't really being tested for combat capability or specific design for US use. However, I do believe that heavier IFVs are the way of the future. Puma is, nearly 45 tons fully kitted out? If people are questioning the survivability of the tank in today's environment, what does that say for something with the armor of a Bradley? There seems little option but to start to build IFVs with protection abilities approaching that of a tank, especially since we can no longer necessarily rely on the idea of the tank being just, perhaps just a touch out front to take the hits, given today's three-dimensional battlefield. Now, whether the procurement guys agree with me or not is, of course, another matter entirely. Maxime Lemont, do I have any information about the Swiss 140mm? That is not easily found after a quick Google search. And no, to my knowledge, there was never any consideration to rearming the Panzer 68 with it. It was used as a trial rig for the gun in '88 before they decided to start taking apart one of their more expensive modern tanks in '89. I can't imagine that the Panzer 68 would take the recoil well anyway. The 120, at least, they made a crack at it. John Kettner. Is there any reason why the Sherman never got the lower drive shaft of M18? So basically, if you look at the M18, what had the radial engine, it actually had a sort of a transfer case that put the output down to the bottom and forward. All in all, it seems a bit pointless to me, because in order to make any particular use of the lowered shaft, you would probably want to redesign the hull to lower the entire thing. You'd have to then set up an entirely new production line, or at least heavily modify what you have. So if you're going to do that, and you just want a lower hulled tank using as many M4A3 components as possible, then you have just made a T-22. And there was also that Israeli cut down Sherman as well that they made one or two of. Okay, Armor and Cavalry. Oh, and by the way, it wasn't worth doing any more of it either. Yeah, it made it lower, but obviously since the Israelis didn't modify them any further, it wasn't worth it. Anyway, Armor and Cavalry. Given the difficulties in establishing air supremacy over Ukraine, have you seen any evidence that the US Army or others are preparing to go back to areas the USAF was previously tasked with? So we're not just talking about anti-aircraft capabilities and maneuver forces, but also electronic warfare or other missions which over time seem to have been sloughed off to the USAF. Sort of. So the Army never entirely left the airborne electronics sphere. The guardrails based on King Airs and the EH-60 quick fixes hung around for quite a long time. However, it's currently flying converted small commuter jets, Ares and Artemis systems, as a sort of a learning in progress while it figures out exactly what it needs for the Hades program, which is also going to be on the base of a converted civilian jet, a bombardier most likely. So that's notwithstanding the various electronics packages which can be placed on the Army's UASs like Grey Eagle, although exactly what those packages can do probably hasn't been made public. Certainly they haven't told me, so I'm pretty sure I couldn't tell you. However, a lot of electronic attack and ELINT is still in the Air Force wheelhouse, which is sort of the point of the joint force concept. So we in the Army get to leverage what the Air Force is doing. That's the idea. Now, the other side of it, though, is that the Air Force seems to have ceded what is being termed the air littoral, basically low-flying UASs and the like, to the Army, and it's now the Army's problem to fix, using whatever assets it deems necessary. As for establishing air supremacy over Ukraine, now I guess you're talking about relative levels. Now note there's a distinction between air superiority and air supremacy, and the latter is extremely hard to attain. So during the NATO bombing campaign of former Yugoslavia, the Air Force never claimed to have total air supremacy. They always qualified it by saying they had air supremacy above 10,000 feet. So if NATO couldn't have complete air supremacy against Serbia, there are limits to the amount of success over Ukraine, and that people haven't managed it is hardly surprising. So if you want to talk about ground-based gear, there's actually a fair bit of it out there already, but the Army has started standing up its intelligence and electronic warfare battalions on the basis of one per division, it looks like right now. I'm still trying to figure out exactly what to do with them myself. John Rayberger. Do different countries have different philosophies regarding mines and mine clearing, e.g. blow in place versus dig up versus use an unmanned vehicle? If so, what are they? In combat, no, not really. As far as I know, pretty much all major nations use a similar combination of line charges, plows and rollers, simply because nothing better has as yet been fielded. It's still a little bit slow though. So the Army is looking for faster ways of doing it. Now, one leading contender right now is a drone swarm, which can detect mines several inches under the ground and lay a charge on them. Now, I'm not sure how that's supposed to work in bad weather, but that's a concern I have on anything where the answer is drones. Now, when it comes to non-combat operations, that's where the flail seems to be the preferred method. It's slow, but pretty thorough. And of course, there's the old-fashioned techniques of detectors, dogs, and poking at things with a stick. There is, of course, the famous jet engine thing, the Progvev, based off of a T-54 or T-55, but that does not seem to have gotten much traction. Wookie Davidson, what happens when a tank crew has their equipment blown off the tank or otherwise damaged when it's in the bustle rack or whatever? What do they do before bustle racks? Well, before bustle racks, if it was really, really important and it was in the tank with them. If not quite so amazingly important, but still important enough to bring onto the tank, a lot of tanks before bustle racks had tie-down points welded to them that you could strap on a haversack or whatever. Otherwise, it just went in the supply truck. It probably wasn't so important that you couldn't wait for it. If it was tank equipment that got blown off, like spare track jacks or something, just borrow off your platoon mate. Sean Davis, have I ever come across an item on a tank or armoured vehicle and gone, what on earth did they put that there for? As an example of something that the designers put on, but the troops never used. I'm sure that over a decade of Inside the Hatches, there are probably a few examples. I think the most controversial one was the installation of the azimuth indicator on the Panther's turret. I still maintain it didn't provide any more practical information that you couldn't figure out just by looking at the turret floor or the direction the ground is moving as you're looking at the periscope. The scale just isn't precise enough to do anything more than you would be doing by yelling at the gunner roughly what you wanted to do anyway. Yet the amount of comments on it going, no, he's there to help guide the gunners. I disagree, but anyway, that's me. Another one is the channel / air vent / whatever the hell it is on the right side of the turret on Sentinel, and I really do need to get back into one day to figure out what it's all about. There are probably others. Go back and watch them all. I need the hit counters to go up anyway. Algorithm doesn't seem to like me recently. All right, the Slaven. Such as the hedgerow cutters. What are other examples of field modifications to tanks being adopted to become official design common practice? Sandbag armor? Well, not official, but common practice. And there are probably quite a few, but I would wager the single largest problem of that of tank infantry coordination. The US Army did not have a particular set answer, and it wasn't helped that tank radios and infantry radios wouldn't talk to each other. So an infantryman in a fight had to get a radio message to a tank 100 yards away. The radio message would have to be passed up at least a battalion, maybe regimental level, depending on whether the tank company or tank battalion, accordingly, had loaned to the infantry a Stuart or Jeep with a tank type radio on it. Then, using what is known today as the swivel chair technique, the message would be passed from the infantry radio tent to the armoured force Jeep or Stuart, and then back down the line to the tank. This was obviously inefficient, and it's pretty astounding that it wasn't picked up on before the various battles in the Pacific and Europe. The initial solution in the Pacific was to leave an EE-8 telephone at the infantry command post, and the tank would drive off unspooling wire behind as it went. And then somebody figured out that the TS-7 phone could be wired directly into the tank's intercom system. So they hung an ammo box on the outside of the tank and then put the phone into it. And that became the origin of the tank infantry telephone in a box in the back of the tank, which has become standard on all tanks all over the world, or at least most tanks all over the world. Yes, other countries before then did have a sort of a doorbell system, but actual communications with the crew was figured out by the men in the field. It's hypothetical. Operation Unthinkable happens immediately after World War II. Would German tank research continue unchanged? Would the Western Allies have simply given what was left of the German forces M4s and called it a day? Well, tank research would certainly not have continued unchanged, as there would be no more interference from a certain politician insisting on more armor or a bigger gun. My guess is that they would concentrate everything German that still ran into one or two specific units and then rearmed all the rest with American gear. Spaceman 28. If MBT-70 were adopted, what sorts of upgrades would have made the A1 version? That's kind of hard to guess, given that the thing never entered service to identify the flaws. But the obvious answer is the elimination of the Shillelagh in favor of the 120mm, and maybe installation of a thermal imager. As time progressed, it became obvious that the cannon was the answer to the missile or cannon question, which the M60 series was trying to bridge between the A1 and the A2. And it seems to have been resolved by the time that MBT-70 would have been due the A1 upgrade. As an aside, there is no particular consensus in Ireland as to how to pronounce Shillelagh. The most common is Shillelagh, what I say, but Shillelagh is also a thing, particularly in the southeast. But if pluralized, I'll almost guarantee that the pronouncer will be Shillelaghs, no matter the base, because normally the Irish equivalent of an S is an I father, which is pronounced E. So Colleen is one girl, Colleen is two girls, that sort of thing. Robert Henry Ilston. As I've been exploring more armoured cars of late, has there been a design choice which just makes you go, huh? Not really. I mean, most of them are pretty reasonable. I'd say the odd one, well, I mean, pretty reasonable considering the design specifications. I mean, XM808, for example, is its own thing. But I'd say the odd one is the rear driving position on the GMC Fox. So the guy who's facing to the rear, and it's not actually the rear driver, it's just whoever decides is going to start steering. He's kind of got the grip on the edge of his steering wheel. Most of it is kind of inside a shelf. But he can get a grip on the edge, so he can steer the vehicle as the armoured car is reversing. The throttle and brake is still controlled by the front driver. So I can only imagine the level of trust that the crew would need to have in each other as they're trying to get away at high speed. And the guy doing the steering is not the guy who can see where they're going or whether or not they need to speed up or slow down. Ian Shaw. There was generally a minimum permitted ammunition capacity in World War II for a vehicle. So for example, the ETO were insistent that they wanted 70 rounds in a tank, and if they had to rejigger Pershing to make it happen and delay the tank, so be it. Was going Winchester, which is basically out of ammo, a common issue? Or was it this demand to reduce the requirements of logistics? Now, I suspect it was to reduce the chance of going Winchester. Now, obviously, the number 70 had to have been arrived at somehow, and I must presume it was considered to be, after experience in past history, a number large enough that tanks were unlikely to run out of ammunition. I certainly don't recall coming across many instances of tanks running out. So I don't think the logistics demand issue is enough of a concern to do it, because the tanks would probably have to stop for fuel more often than for ammo. And whenever refueling, they could also bomb up, and the trucks would be there either way. So my guess is they simply figured that in combat, they would have time to stop and reload by the time they hit 70 rounds. Also, why is the original Bradley thermal imager red and the original Abrams one green? And I have absolutely no idea. I personally found the green one to be easier to use, but it wasn't as if I couldn't acquire and engage targets with the red. So maybe somebody out there knows. Also, if a Bradley is knocked out when the dismounts are dismounted, how do they continue the fight when the platoon moves on again? The immediate thought is that the official answer to any question of how many people can fit in vehicle type X is one more. I doubt it will be comfortable, but it beats walking. Now, that said, the CO and XO's vehicles probably have a little bit of spare room in them. Certainly, I had no dismounts assigned to my Bradley when I was a Cav Troop CO. Kazuki K. Obviously, the turret monster is a threat in modern vehicles with rapid traverse. Wouldn't it be less of a risk in older vehicles, since the comparatively slower traverse, especially if it's manual, might allow you to yell at the gunner to stop before it was too late? And I would suspect not as much as an improvement as one might think. The whole point of getting something caught in the turret monster is that you don't realize that your foot is in the wrong place or whatever until you start to feel pain. Otherwise, you would have moved it preventatively and the turret monster wouldn't have been an issue to begin with. I further suspect that by the time you start to feel pain, even a slower manual traverse may well have had the time in the next second or two to change that pain into breakage. So, crank, 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 crank. Ow, gunner, stop. By the time this gets processed and the gunner stops cranking, your foot doesn't have that much give in it. Now, there would perhaps be more chance for survival without damage if it was like a loose item of clothing which you start to feel getting tugged and you got a couple of inches of give before more vital parts of you get crushed. Related, was there a breach monster in casemated vehicles? Probably. More likely though, you'd be crushing equipment more than people, I think. Would the maintenance checklist be more thorough in an open-topped vehicle than a closed-top vehicle which is protected from the elements? For example, between the 76mm gun on an M18 and the same gun in a Sherman. And no, I cannot imagine that it would be. You would have the same lubrication points, same functions checks, and so on. Now, they might perhaps fail more often on open-topped vehicles. But I can't see the actual manual and inspection points being any different. Little Z has a final countdown type question. How well would M48A3, M41 Walker Bulldog, or M551 Sheridan have performed, assuming both vehicles and blueprints were sent back in time? I can imagine the Ordnance Branch officers were looking at the guidance system of the Shillelaghs and going, what the hell is this? Where are the vacuum tubes? A combustible case using what now? M41, on the other hand, is just a gradual progression of World War II technology, and that would have been more a case of, oh, that's a good way of doing that. Why didn't we think of that a bit earlier? Tankers would probably have loved the M48. There isn't anything much in there that wasn't at least within the comprehension of folks in World War II. I can imagine Ordnance Branch looking at one though and thinking, well, how the hell are we going to get that monster out of a ditch with our M32s? The only thing which comes to mind to worry about is whether the 80-octane fuel, which was standard for the US Army at the time, would have been acceptable in the more modern engines in Patton. That's just, that's assuming actually A3 you've moved to the diesel, haven't you? I have absolutely no idea about the fuel quality of World War II diesel, sorry. Also, how effective were M48s in Vietnam? More effective than originally anticipated. The thinking was that things wouldn't be useful in the jungle until a Marine unit brought its tanks along because nobody told them not to. And then they discovered they were pretty good. The Aussies came to a similar conclusion when they started bringing Centurions along. Sebastian Cranen, care to waffle on the video where the two Bradleys took out a T-90? Written on 15th January. It hasn't really been this long since I did a Q&A. I still, to this day, do not understand why vehicles from both sides continue to drive around without any support whatsoever, especially tanks in relatively close terrain. So in that video, if you remember, there's the T-90 comes down, the Bradley's going up, the machine guns basically, the Bradley with the autocannon, and another Bradley comes along. So that second Bradley was not close enough to mutually support the first. It kind of had to race to the rescue while the first one's going away. The T-90 itself, which was of course also on its own, well, to be fair to the tank, it did protect the crew who escaped. The tank was destroyed, yes. But as I said, they shouldn't have gone around on their own like that in the first place, and they deserved what they got. Now, as I said, the result could just as easily have been dead Bradley if the Russian crew were more on the ball. So I'm reminded a little bit of that Syrian rebel M113, whatever it was, playing tag with a T-72. They got away with it. They drove right up to the T-72, went around and vanished. But then again, you also had that BTR-82, I think it was 2 or 3 days ago, that apparently tried to do the same thing with the Ukrainian T-64 and got nailed at, I can't be more than 25 meters range. And I'm kind of curious though, what on earth was going through the tank's intercom as I see this BTR charging at them. It's one of ours? They can't be the enemy. Can it be the enemy? I think it's the enemy. Okay, shoot it. I can't keep up. Anyway. So anyway, that Syrian T-72, they got away with it, as I say, but I don't know if I were them, if I would like to chance it a second time. John Cryer. What are my thoughts on some of the, some kind of combined arms light formation? Correction, combined arms light armored formation. And so he's thinking things like the South African or French units, which were primarily wheeled vehicles, but also had heavy components like Oliphants or AMX-30s on call. And I can't say I'm a fan, and there's probably a reason why such organizations tended to go away. It seems to me that you're attempting to cover all the bases at too low a level. If the obstacles are such that the heavier vehicles can't cross, at least something can go across, if not everything. I guess that's the point. But then if the opposition is such that the heavier vehicles aren't needed, then why bother trying to bring the heavier vehicles along at all? Just have them as an entirely separate formation, which can be attached as necessary. The only advantage of this formation I can think of is that there would be a habitual relationship in the same organization between the various elements. So when they did have to work together, they would already know each other. Seems a bit inefficient to me. If you want a heavy unit, make a proper heavy unit. And this debate kind of comes and goes. We've gone away now from the armored recon squadrons in the US being the mix of Humvees and Bradleys. That was an armored recon squadron in my day. And I was never really a fan of it because it seemed to me that it had the liabilities of both type of vehicle in the same formation, which meant that you were restricted, you were more restricted in some ways than if you only had the one type of vehicle or the other. So it's worth noting that the wheeled vehicles have gone away and now it's just tanks and Bradleys. Also, what's my thought on the AMX's 20mm cannon? Again, the answer is that there's a reason it went away. It has the advantage of higher elevation than the main gun, so it could be dangerous to targets in buildings or aircraft which were really, and I do mean really close. So do the maths to see just how close a helicopter needs to be to you at, say, 50-meter altitude before your 20-degree elevation gun can't hit it. And with the AMX-10P IFV alongside, having basically the same cannon, you've just sucked up space in your tank for a redundant 20mm and the associated ammunition. I think the designers were at the time thinking, what does a tank need? More than the more realistic question of, what does a tank which is fighting as part of a formation need? And it's the old thing from a couple of months ago. You buy things, but you fight formations. So, I mean, the 20mm was certainly a fad of the time. Panzer 61 and MBT-70 also had 20mm. And of course, there was that early Centurion from the earlier generation. But I've never seen any documentation on the debates which resulted in having them. But I mean, at least the MBT-70 predated Bradley by a few good years, but so maybe there was something on that one. Anyway, back to Little Z, decided to come back for another question. If the Jagdpanzer 38T was so cramped, why not just make more Marder 3s? It's got a good gun, uses the same general chassis and production line, also saves on steel. And I have had the same thought. Plus, in combat, the Marder has better vision, faster rate of fire, and off the top of my head, greater traverse of the gun. The only thing I can think of is that the Germans were gaining a very healthy respect for artillery airbursts and maybe aircraft attack. Marder kind of sucked in comparison there. Adam Schindler, when does the threat matrix shift from being ground-centric to air-centric for armor? And is the armor different for US armor as opposed to armor facing off against the US? And it kind of depends upon your frame of reference. So a couple of years ago, when we were doing an overview of division level operations 180, I recall one of the senior leaders observing that M1s can kill T90s all day. That didn't worry him. What worried him was the stuff his M1s couldn't kill. And he wasn't wrong, it's something I mentioned before. And this stuff is stuff which exists far beyond the current front line of troops. So that becomes a battle of reconnaissance, and airborne eyes, like drones, are a large part of that fight. I do hope to do a video on this larger context, but I haven't really had time yet to dig into the materials to see exactly what is open source or not. Obviously I know a little bit more than I'm probably free to talk about, but there is a misconception out there about how larger units fight. So to quote my current commanding general, as a division commander, he is mildly interested as to what his brigades are doing. He's got competent brigade commanders, they'll take care of the fighting. The trick for division and higher is to make sure that the fighting happens on our terms. It's the old Sun Tzu thing, you win the battle first and then you actually fight it. So given this means affecting things in the relative distance, there is a lot of air, ELINT, space, etc. related stuff which is going on, which is of critical importance to the survival of the tank at the front line. If division and higher do their jobs in the air, electronic space and so on worlds, the tanks and the tankers inside them will probably survive the battle. And the converse is true for Red Fort. So if a Red tank battalion is suffering the loving attentions of an attack helicopter company, for example, either they screwed up long before the first missile started flying, or they were so hopelessly overmatched that the outcome wasn't in question to begin with anyway. So again, I'll look into the public FMs and maybe one day end up actually making a current doctrine video. I suspect this may be another area of difference between how NATO armies are trained to fight versus how the Russians and possibly Ukrainians are doing it. And it's an example as to why only limited lessons can be taken from Ukraine. Although again, I have not researched the question and I may be entirely off base on that. Another question, what is the difference between a front, a theatre and a campaign? A theatre is a large geographic area which doesn't exactly care where the battle line is. So we're talking almost continent-sized. Pacific, Western Europe, Russian front, which is a misnomer for theatre. The word front has a slightly more defined definition depending on what country you're in. So a front in the Soviet army was the same as an army group in the US. More normally though, it just means where the two sides actually meet each other. A campaign is a related series of operations to achieve a specific objective, such as capture Normandy and set conditions to take the war into the rest of France. I would submit that a campaign differs from an operation in that an operation is more a sequential series of battles, while a campaign can have multiple operations happening at the same time. Are or were there rations which are preferred by or work better for tankers compared to other branches? Well, the weight of food is much less of an issue for a tanker because the tank carries it. I suspect the question is inverse from what it should be, which would be, are there foods which are better suited for the infantry than others? Similar, another question is whether or not it's required to heat it. So in the days before MREs, you had to carry your fuel or your stove around with you. Again, if it's on the tank, it's easy, carrying a little stove. If it's food which requires heating before it's palatable, and there are certain MREs I would say meet that requirement, then if carrying or setting up a heater is a concern, you probably don't want that food. As long as the food in question does not include a certain A fruit, I'm sure it'll be fine for a tanker. Tim Dalrymple. Watching the video of the YouTuber Range Day, I spotted a familiar cav hat walking around. Now, this, by the way, was something in Texas a good few months ago, not the Finnish brutality videos I did more recently. What was your favorite / most interesting gun present? And did you bring your own? Well, I kind of crashed the party, and thus never read the memo that you didn't need to bring your own firearms. I brought my AXR, which everybody thought was an AUG, reasonably enough, and the X95. Just left them on the table and let anybody who wanted to shoot one shoot it. Interestingly, the AXR was far more popular than the Tavor was. Now, going the other way, the obvious eye-catcher for me was the 13mm heavy machine gun, which came off a Japanese heavy armored car, which was Japanese speak for light tank not owned by infantry, a bit like the US Army had combat cars for the cavalry. Weapon was owned by a chap named Tyler Pickerel. He was one of the very, very few folks who actually recognized me, because I guess not very many American gun tubers are interested in armored vehicle history. Anyway, he very graciously let me loose a full magazine at a Humvee. There is a tiny caveat in that 13mm Japanese ammunition is a touch difficult to come by these days, so he had converted it to a caliber 50 American round, but apparently it wasn't too hard to do. Still, for a tanker to fire something built to be mounted on a 1930s Japanese tankette, that was something quite special, and he has earned my eternal gratitude for that. And he has suffered an accident recently. I do wish him well, and hope he makes a fairly speedy recovery as best he can. Robert, okay, you're opening a can of worms there, and that is what I'm not going to get into on this video. I have heard from more than one person that we should have never gotten rid of the last Armor Cavalry Regiment. And no, in this context, Black Horse does not count. And I have heard that we should get one back again, but unfortunately we are hitting force structure limitations. It is not the only organization everyone says we need, but we simply don't have the manpower and budget to implement it. So we just have to make do with whatever else we can find, such as using an armored brigade that we may happen to have lying around in the ACR role. The problem there, we got rid of the separate armored brigades about the same time as we got rid of 3rd ACR. So that would mean that some division commander somewhere is going to see his division split up. Now, he also wishes to inform me that the Belgian pricker from the series of videos I did in Belgium is a modern version of the early 20th century naval daughter, which I did not know. That guy named Seth. Why did the Soviets choose to mount a DShKT on their tanks instead of a KPV? Well, there were apparently two answers to this. The first, courtesy of Tankolad, is they actually did want the 14.5 in their tanks, but by the time they figured out how to mount them well enough, the air threat was so advanced with jets and the like that they decided it just wasn't worth it. It went away until the last model year, the T-62. And as for that and then the T-72 onwards, I expect you're going to see very similar arguments as were made against a 20mm just a few moments ago. So you're talking about a somewhat larger round, which reduces ammunition capacity, and a bigger gun, which in fairness may be less of an issue for a tank external mount, for the sake of a secondary weapon. Now, if it's the primary weapon, like on a BTR or a BRDM, I can see it. But if the primary purpose is anti-aircraft work, and most probably deterrence effect, I can see the argument for longer belts for a more dramatic tracer effect. And then, of course, the target in question at this point is more helicopter like Cobra or Huey than it was airplane like F-105 or other jet attack aircraft. And a 12.7 is going to do a number on a Cobra quite well anyway. Con of class. How would the Commonwealth designs, Sentinel, Ram or Schofield have fared had they entered frontline service? Schofield was covered only a couple of Q&As ago. Sentinel, okay, I guess. Especially given that by the time the thing would have been ready, the Aussies were fighting the Japanese in Pacific. So the small tank with good Cadillac engines and a good enough gun, especially if they did something like the single 25-pounder for main armament, would have done well. I mean, the issue there was simply the prioritization of resources, which is what nailed the tank in real life anyway. Ram, the problem with Ram was a 6-pounder gun. You really needed a 75mm to make a useful tank. And there's a reason why the 6-pounder was rejected on the M7 medium once they figured out how to make a 75mm fit into it. At which point, if you put a 75 into a Ram, you basically have a Sherman anyway. Bo Sabre, 23. US tank crews in the Pacific took the threat of Japanese magnetic anti-tank mines very seriously, putting wood or whatever all over the tank to reduce the chances of them getting attached. Why wasn't there some form of institutional response from the US, like a kit which could be issued out, or maybe a form of Zimmerit? Well, apparently there actually was an attempt. In February of 1944, tests were carried out in Michigan on a Stuart that they happened to have around, of a non-magnetic material which could be applied to a tank with local equipment like a piece of wood. It was given 48 hours to harden. They then stuck a Japanese mine on the thing and drove it around on rough ground to see if the tank mine would dislodge. If it didn't dislodge, they then thwapped it with a hammer to see if it would dislodge. Now, I know what the tests were and that they happened, but I have no idea what the result was. However, one can make two inferences. First, the test seemed to assume that the mine would be attached to at least some degree. Otherwise, they wouldn't be trying to get it to fall off. And these were the requirements, the test requirements, not oh, bugger, the mine attached. Let's see what happens. They assumed from the beginning that the tank would attach to the mine would attach to some extent. So the material must have been tried in order to weaken the magnetic connection instead of eliminating it entirely. Well, if the fuse on the mine was short enough, then driving around and hope it would dislodge due to a weaker magnetic field isn't sufficient. Secondly, since this material wasn't fielded, if the mine not falling off quickly enough wasn't the cause of non-issuance, the other logical conclusions are either A, they didn't think enough tanks were being lost to be worth the effort, or B, it simply failed the tests. I'm going to go either for one, they realized that weakening it wasn't good enough, or B, it simply failed the tests. However, on the basis of shoot the archer, not the arrow, by early 1945, they were trying other things out. They first tried running explosive piping along the sides, which kind of worked, although you could actually get the pipes to blow by shooting at them. The bigger problem was that the explosive was so strong, it seemed to affect the armor of the tank. Then they tried anti-personnel mines. These would leap out about 6 feet before blowing, and you could have several of them together, so you could fire it several times. They also tried hand grenades attached to the armor. And they even ran a sort of a Hogan's Alley for the tank crews. They would drive around in close terrain and they wouldn't have any advanced knowledge of where these targets are. And the targets were positioned so that they could not be seen until they were basically practically at point blank range. And so the crew would detonate the system when they thought they needed to, given the targets that they saw. Finally, on the basis that perhaps the Japanese might climb on top of the vehicle, they also mounted some on the turret, which would blow upwards and get folks on the turret roof. The end result was that the anti-personnel mines were preferred for the sides because they had a greater radius of effect. But static grenades, the hand grenades, were preferred for the front and rear because the AP mines, the anti-personnel, had a tendency to damage periscopes or air filters when they detonated away from the vehicle. Finally, of course, this too seems not to have been fielded, so that presumably they decided that an easier solution was better cooperation with the infantry, or that results coming back were that the wooden protection in the field seems to be working just fine, so let them keep doing it, wasn't worth the effort. So again, it's worth pointing out the difference between, okay, the sandbags have a definite problem, the wooden mine, wood doesn't weigh that much, maybe it's not worth objecting to. Bo Saber also asks what model hat the current CAV hat is based on. And in fairness, there is no official answer. You'll see CAV guys wearing all sorts of hats. But the stereotypical one is apparently, it was based on whatever was going around in the early 1960s and looked reasonably similar to earlier hats, maybe from the movies. 11th CAV uses 1901 pattern hats. The US military basically went through a pattern a year for the late 19th and early 20th century, so there are quite a few hats which look reasonably close in shape. He also asks, could the M4 with HVSS be equipped with a dozer blade? Yes, the M2 blade for sure. Why weren't the M36s refitted with HVSS systems during conversion from M10? Well, the immediate thought is it just wasn't considered worth the effort. I'm not sure many M4s ever converted from the one to the other either. But this is already a lighter vehicle. Do you really need the wider tracks? And the other thought is that the angled sponson coming back in actually somewhat covers the track. So if you want to make the track several inches wider, you have to remove some of the side sponson armor. So as I say, being lighter than the M4, maybe it simply had acceptable ground pressure as it was. I have not seen any question or any document specifically addressing it, however. John, if there were an MBT from history I could bring back into production, what would it be? You can include prototypes like MBT-70. I have no idea. MBT-70 is a good answer. The T-95s, not the T-28 Super Heavy, the T-95 medium tanks, that would have been interesting to see driving around. But I guess the actual answer is anything of which an example no longer exists. If we can remake steam locomotives and ME-262s and even Titanic, like that Australian nutter wants to do, why can we not do it with a tank? Which reminds me, I need to see how that T1 thrust is going. Robert Ohlweiler, why was the Royal Ordnance L7 selected by the US Army over the T140? Well, technically, the gun selected was the T254E2, which mated the British tube and fired the same ammunition. Whatever. The bottom line is that yes, the T140 was more powerful, but the gun weighed a full ton more, it was far longer, and the ammunition was huge. T140 ammunition came between 50 to 75 pounds, while the British ammunition was 40 to 55 pounds. And if the British rounds were good enough for the job, fired out of the British gun tube, and arguably they were, why go with the bigger gun? Zaid, I actually know absolutely nothing about the Iraqi M1 fleet, its plans for modernization, or how they are currently received by the troops. However, I suspect you may be presuming that just because they received A1s, this implied that they received inferior tanks. The US's Abrams upgrade program at the time was running a few different tracks, and AIMs, and particularly the SA tanks, were more modern than the M1A2 SEPs that, say, Saudi or Kuwait had at the time the Iraqi tanks were delivered. Now, yes, Saudi has since been upgrading its own Abrams, however. Some US units, were still taking delivery of the M1 A1 Ames SAs at the time that the Iraqis were getting theirs as well. Now these are fully digitized tanks. The difference between that and the A2s coming off at the same time was basically just cost. Did folks at the time really want to fork out for a CITV at the time that Iraq had its significant domestic problems? The answer is probably no. A Turkish gamer. Did the US ever consider a shaped charge round for the 75mm? And the short answer, it seems, is no. At least I could find no evidence one after a brief search. Of course, somebody's going to prove me wrong now in the comments, but anyway. If they really wanted to make a better AP round for the 75mm, they could have placed the HVAP round into service. They did develop one. I guess they simply didn't think it was worth the effort. Have I played a game which genuinely makes me want to tear my hair out? Yes, I'm sure there have been. Usually these are ones which have bugger all for an instruction manual and zilch by way of a tutorial. Sure, I'll just go on Discord and ask questions there or whatever. Am I the only person who really misses getting an honest-to-God book with their computer games, preferably with backstory and lore and all that? I mean, I get it, it's digital download for games, but a PDF would be nice. Anyway, that's my rant. That also brings us to an end of the Q&A. So, yeah, as I say, it's back to normal business. Got one or two Inside the Hatches filmed, museum tour. Sure, we'll see what comes over the coming weeks. But until then, as I say, the t-shirts are on sale. Look for the link in the description of the video. And, right. I'll get around to editing. I've got like 48 hours to get this out. All right. Take care all. Talk to you on the next one.